Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host as always, Steve Hall, and today I'm joined by Alex and Mike Israetel once again, and they are going to hate against one another again for an hour, so you can enjoy that. Although if we can just not bring up an MRV this time, that would be quite nice.
I can't make any promises. You know me. You know me. It's the only thing I have.
You love an MRV joke. I know that.
My favorite kind of joke.
So today, the guys are going to talk a bit about some other aspects of hypertrophy, mostly muscle damage, and then kind of metabolites, cell swelling, the applications, and practically what would that mean for programming. And I think, Alex, if you want to start off with where your kind of understanding of muscle damage is in terms of hypertrophy, maybe just summarize, because I know we kind of did an episode talking about it in quite some depth as well.
Yeah. So we did that one podcast where we scraped the surface after the amino acid discussion. I got kind of interested in muscle damage because most of my research has to do with the mechanisms of muscle hypertrophy. And if you look back at the research, almost like the premise of like the mechanistic stuff for hypertrophy, it was kind of like muscle damage. They kind of speculated muscle damage from a long time ago. It's basically because we didn't have a lot of direct studies. We didn't have the technology available at that time to really see. So it became speculatory, and then over time, they can actually see the damage occurring, and then they kind of just draw these conclusions of muscle damage causes hypertrophy. And it was kind of an interesting model that not a lot of people went against for a while, because it kind of made sense. You go to the gym, you break something apart, and then you eat, recover, and it grows back. And no one really said anything against that for a long time until we had more research coming out showing that, at least recently anyway, where I think like Felipe Damas, had a few studies now showing that damage may not be the primary driver. And I think by now, between myself, Mike, everyone else who's way smarter than me, speculate that tension is probably the primary driver. And then it's like, how much tension do we have? And that's where volume comes into play. So I started to research muscle damage directly, looked at a lot of reviews. And there's nothing that really points to damage being causative. It might be synergistic. I don't even have a very, very little data that even kind of speculates that it might be causative, but I really don't think that muscle damage is warranted in training. I personally think that it's just a side effect of training. And I think Mike actually just put a really cool infographic, super easy to read infographic. I think it was like a Word doc or something, that kind of showed what can cause damage and how that can actually cause growth too. As damage, it causes damage as a side effect, but like novelty of exercise that you and I talked about as being probably pretty important for hypertrophy, eccentric contractions, that sort of thing. So in my small article that I sent you that's on my my blog, it goes into some pretty good detail on muscle damage. And basically I lay it out as saying that it's just a side effect, in my opinion. There's a very casual role with maybe some molecular stuff like calcium signaling, but you also get that in like concentric contractions too. So I think it has to do with more being a side effect of eccentric contractions, and how eccentric contractions are very powerful and provide more tension and lower cost of energy. So that's kind of where I stand right now, is it's just being a side effect. So I'll let Mike pick up on that before going further.
All that's wrong. And Alex, let me be clear. It's not wrong because things about it are actually incorrect. It's because you're stupid. That's what I think, and really, as smart as I am, what I think is true. So back to you.
Yeah, I apologize.
That's it. You should. How dare you? Okay. Yeah. So that was really good stuff. I can't say I disagree with any of that. I think the damage and growth thing is still a little bit mysterious, right? We want to be careful not to rule out something we can't really rule out yet. And unfortunately or not, we can't rule out damage yet as a potential driver of hypertrophy. But we certainly can't say that it is a driver of hypertrophy yet. And one of the reasons is because it's really tough to pick apart damage and defective modalities. For example, someone could say, well, tension is the driver of hypertrophy. That's right on. How do you impose enough tension to get a robust hypertrophic response without simultaneously damaging muscle tissue? The answer is there's really no way to do it, right? Tension causes some damage, right? So I definitely, there's definitely some mystery there. That being said, I think we know enough about damage and hypertrophy to be able to get two ends of the spectrum of damage and growth as labeled unlikely to be true. And so we got this whole spectrum of damage and growth from a ton of damage to no damage at all or very little. And I think we can zoom into here and say this is probably good and out here is probably not a good idea. And I think that is really cool as a real world workable recommendation for training. And then we can actually use assessments of damage in training as potential proxies for hypertrophy, or if not proxies for hypertrophy, just directions in which to go for training. So let's lay this out and you guys can tear it apart. This is probably all fucking wrong. So we can make the assumption that any amount of damage directly inhibits some amount of hypertrophy. And this comes from the understanding that the recovery adaptation resource pool is this finite amount of stuff. And that any amount of damage you do just shrinks the amount left for adaptation. It's a very reasonable idea. It could very well be true. But at the same time, it's also true that the very tension that causes the damage as a byproduct, the more of it you get, the more adaptation you milk out. So it's kind of like if you look at it like this, any amount you train, damage goes up and the stimulus goes up. Let's say it's not even causative, right? Just correlative. If you say, I don't want any damage, you're by definition saying I want no stimulus at all, right? And if you say, okay, well, let's train more and train more and train more, at some point, we don't know where the stimulus is worth the damage. It's for sure worth the damage at some point, right? Because if you really said no damage at all is the ideal, nobody would grow because zero damage would result. So some amount of stimulus is worth the damage. The question is how much. And here is my sort of hypothetical scenario that I think might be useful. We know, let us assume, just to be conservative, that damage competes completely with hypertrophy and that any damage that we have that we don't need to have is a bad idea, okay? In that case, let's say we're training with 3 sets per session per muscle group, and we are getting no indicators at all of any kind of damage, right? If we do blood work, there's no creatine kinase spillover. If we do strength assessments, there's no strength decrement at any time point post-session. There's no soreness whatsoever. There's no acute soreness. There's no delayed soreness, nothing. You guys know the kind of workout. You go in and do 3 sets of curls and you're like, nothing happened, okay? So that kind of workout, let's say someone was to confidently proclaim that doing any more than that would be suboptimal. Now, that's a bit tricky because you could say, well, doesn't the research show that generally more volume is better, especially when you're considering low volumes? It's, yeah, but damage, right? Okay, damage is bad. But because we're not really detecting a whole lot of damage at 3 sets, isn't it worth exploring 4 sets and seeing how that feels? And if 4 sets gives us fucking crazy DOMs, tons of strength loss, well, shit, we should just go back to 3, right? But if we try 4, then it works well, and we, either that session and in 2 or 3 sessions, we manage to be recovering super well. There's no apparent DOMs or any kind of damage indicator around. Then we say, oh, gee, we're getting 4 work sets now. It's almost certainly more hypertrophic stimulus. Still with a very low to manageable amount of damage, it's probably worth it on the net balance. So that's the one side of the coin. So I would say so the real world implication here is if someone tells you, hey, I'm training like this, you say, do you how do you feel after training sessions? Do you have less strength loss? Do you get sore? Do you get delayed onset soreness? And if they tell you, look, I feel fucking totally fine. I can't tell that I trained. Almost certainly, if damage even competes with hypertrophy, then the answer is, oh, okay, that's cool. Maybe you can explore doing a little bit more volume because it's probably going to get you more growth and you don't have to worry about damage yet. And if you bump into damage, you wait it out, chill out, maybe go back and then try bumping again. Someone's actually tried this. James Krieger had an autoregulatory volume adjustment experiment he did on himself, where he didn't even use performance the first time. He used just plain old soreness. He's like, if something got me sore, I would stop adding volume to it. And then when it didn't get me sore anymore, I started adding volume again. And, his own, for whatever an N of 1 is worth, he said he had great results, right? But it sort of makes theoretical sense. Then on the other hand, let's say someone says, I'm training with 8 sets per session, 3 times a week, and I have overlapping DOMs. Like, I'm never actually not sore. I come into a workout sore, I get more sore, I leave, and I don't get completely healed, and I hit the next workout, so on and so on and so forth. If we're real serious about damage competing with hypertrophy, which I think the DAMA series of studies and just general theory says probably should be taken seriously, then this is unlikely that such an approach is optimal, right? I would go so far as to say it's probably just going to cause you to reduce performance over a long time and probably get you hurt. But even if it doesn't do that, it's almost certainly not the right way to do things. So if someone says, like, I'm doing I'm doing sets of 8 for chest 3 times a week, and you're like, how are you feeling? Like, I'm sore literally all the time, literally all the fucking time. You say, yeah, gee, maybe you should pare it back to 5 or 6 sets, and you'll recover better, and you'll probably do better because you won't have as much damage competing with adaptations. They do that, and they find, oh my God, I have much better results. So damage and hypertrophy relationship, even if it's one of any amount of damage is bad, or some damage is bad, or even damage is hypertrophic to a point, right? Because it's for sure to a point. No one in their right mind thinks the more damage you cause, the more you grow. That's fucking insane, right? It's just wrong based on literature. It's mechanistically impossible, right? You just cut your muscle open and seal it back, and it'll be fucking Ronnie Coleman next time. It doesn't work, right? So all systems have their boundaries. So whatever amount of damage correlates to hypertrophy, we can still have that rubric where there is such a thing as, if you're just not getting any fucking evidence of damage, you could probably train more and get better. If you're really, really, really fucked up, you probably should be training less. So we have this little boundary, and within it, the nuance is very interesting. I made a lecture for RP Plus where I have 3 different models of damage and hypertrophy compete directly at the very lowest levels. Then there's an intermediate moderate amount of damage that's optimal. And then the other one is like a pretty high amount of damage, but still recovers before the next session is optimal. They lead to slightly different understandings of how you should train, but in none of them do you show up to the gym, feel not a goddamn thing, and say, I'm growing my best ever. And in none of them do you show up to the gym completely fucked up every time and be like, this is just how you grow, bro. So what do you guys think about that? Alex, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I like that. I would like to clear one thing up is, even in my article, I kind of paint a picture of a lot of it being negative towards muscle damage. But towards the end, it kind of calculates what you kind of said, where it's kind of mysterious. It's like murky water there. There is some tiny little bit of evidence showing it could possibly be anabolic. Maybe. I wouldn't hang my hat on that. But I would also say that you mentioned that tension almost always equals muscle damage to a degree. If you're putting tension on a muscle, I would like to bring up repeated bout effect, of course, where that is nicely displayed in a DAMA study and many others, where maybe when you begin a mesocycle with new volume or taking time off, etc., you're going to have a lot of muscle damage. Muscle protein synthesis is going to be skyrocketing, but there's just not a lot of hypertrophy, or maybe none at all, happening for a while. Then a repeated bout effect takes place, but there's still tension on the muscle. So tension is still there, but with the repeated bout effect, there's less and less and less damage. We start to see more hypertrophy. But I do think that muscle damage will be there, and it's not something that you should completely avoid by any means. I don't think you should go into a training session like, I'm not going to get any muscle damage. It's definitely going to be a side effect, but I'm just playing the card saying you shouldn't look for muscle damage all the time. You shouldn't be going after it like, hey, I'm going to damage the fuck out of my biceps today every time you go in, which I think is a problem with some people. They go hard, brother. They want to fucking tear it apart, and then they get, like you said, it runs to recoverable problems. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I think this is maybe where we split our views a little bit. I think damage is something that you should be aware of, because I don't know if this is what you're saying, and if it's not, please correct me. A lot of folks who say we shouldn't be chasing muscle damage, in the next breath say muscle damage is irrelevant to hypertrophy. I don't think it's irrelevant. Well, it's for sure not irrelevant, because the DAMA studies, if they're remotely indicative of physiological reality, damage is not irrelevant to hypertrophy because it's competitive with hypertrophy at high levels, right? And then we can also say that if you're not getting any damage at all and you're not upping the volume, you can't possibly answer the question of why not, because the answer is wrong. Like, more volume is better for sure if you're not accruing any damage. We're talking about, you're essentially arguing against studies that, one set of 10 isn't as hypertrophic as 2 or 3 sets of 10. I mean, the universal answer is, of course not, right? So then what I would say is we shouldn't be chasing the most damage possible. 100%, that's fucking stupid. But we maybe should be chasing an intermediate amount of damage, not because it is itself hypertrophic, but it correlates to the amount of tension that may likely cause maximum hypertrophy, in the sense that if you get no damage, are you really doing enough volume to challenge your physiology to grow? I would say probably not. Now, if your retort is, well, yeah, you could be, holy shit, you just discovered the greatest fucking way to train ever. Cause almost no damage, throughput enough tension for reliable growth. Fuck me, that's like, you don't ever need deload. You just grow forever. That's unfortunately just not the case, right? Anyone who has trained remotely longer than 6 months realizes that in order to continue to grow, damage is gonna come along for the ride some level, whether or not that is do as much work as you possibly can until you get some level of detectable damage, which may very well be true, or if that answer is get as much damage as you can so long as you heal before your next session. I don't think that one's true, but maybe. Or if it's somewhere in between, like get a little bit fucked up, but not too much and not too little, and that's the best. I think damage, because we're targeting those particular zones, I don't know which zone to target personally, although I have my bias to the first two and not the last one. I think that damage is instructive, potentially as an autoregulatory mechanism, the detection of such damage through whatever ways you can. Maybe a good autoregulatory mechanism for your training program, not the only one. I think performance is ultimately the best one, but certainly something that is instructive. For example, if you're start a program, say, and you're doing 5 sets of 10, and you're so fucking sore you can't shit properly, are you willing to bet you're growing your most muscle? I'm willing to bet you're not, and I have the DAMA studies to support that. You know what I mean? Like, you're so fucking sore, your body's barely recovering. It's directly competing against gains. So a lot of times people say, like, it's okay, muscle damage. We'll say, like, hey, are you sore? They're like, yeah, but I'm going to train anyway. Like, why? Well, because so-and-so on the internet said that damage and muscle growth have nothing to do with each other. Like, that's wrong, right? So there's the one side, and then the other side of the coin that keep competing is, if you're causing no damage at all, hardly any technical damage, and you're doing this through, which you have to do through low volumes, then the question becomes, why don't you just do higher volumes? And there's no good retort to that that's evidence-based or theoretically sound. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think that's a good way to look at that as well. As I think it's kind of two different ways of looking at the same thing. I think we're saying the same thing, but kind of two different angles where I still don't chase damage, but I'm aware of it. So I still try and chase volume. I'm not against volume. I want to be very clear about that from the past podcast. I'm not against volume. I'm against huge volume jumps, especially if you don't need them. I think I'd agree on. But with those volume jumps over time, even small rep progressions, you can get tiny amounts of damage, which it's there for the ride. I wouldn't say, oh, fuck, I can't do increase that rep because I'm going to get damaged. And that doesn't, no, absolutely not. But it's the degree of the muscle damage for sure. And that's why I wanted to write that article, because there are still a lot of people go out and just, they have that in their head that damage equals hypertrophy. So they go out and literally try and do as much damage. Then I find out things like eccentric training causes damage. They do everything eccentric fucking, and then there's I
remember those days.
Yeah, I've been there, and so that's what I was trying to put out. I also would like to point out that I would like to hear your opinion at least. I've seen some studies where soreness doesn't always equate to muscle damage. So it definitely does. It definitely does. So what do you think?
Sorry, continue. I don't mean to cut you off.
No, go ahead, asshole. Go fucking. No,
I'll talk when I want to talk.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Were you? Was that your question, or did you have more?
Yeah, my question was to you. I've seen studies where, of course, it's in a lab. They're on like ISO denominator, ISO machines and all that shit, and they're looking at soreness and like force production, and they're looking at damage as well via biopsy or ultrasound. And they basically found that muscle soreness doesn't always equate to muscle damage. So if that is true, then when you're coming in and you're basing things off soreness, it doesn't always mean that there's damage present. So what do you think about that?
So soreness is not a perfect proxy for damage. One of the number one reasons for that is people are not perfect, reliable indicators of how sore they are. Soreness is a perceptive measure, so people are going to have a subjective bias one way or another, or just not be very good at detecting things. So, for example, your degree of sort of like nociceptive precision can be relatively low to where you just don't feel much pain in your muscles until there's significant amount of damage. On the other hand, you could have like a bro attitude of like, nah, I'm fucking good, I'm not sore. You know, people will just make that up in lab. Like, I'll do this. It's super easy. You know, you get a fucking, you know, a girl in the lab, and you have her do isokinetic dynamometry, and you get like one of the lab guys, one of the research assistants is a really good looking guy, and the girl wants to impress the guy, so he's like, are you sore? She's like, no, of course not, this is easy. You're like, or the other way around, right? But it's like, that happens all the time in college. It's fucking college. You got master's students evaluating undergrads. It's all like, I'm going to impress these people. Like, by the way, these are all volunteers normally. Like, they volunteer for this, so they're almost always people are like, oh, I never get sore. Like, so it's one of those things where I imagine most of that error comes from just perception. I've looked at a number of studies that assess perceptive degrees or sort of perceptive scales of soreness and correlate them to damage. The correlation is good, but it's not perfect. Because it's not perfect, it doesn't mean anything other than the fact that we can't use perceptive soreness as the only indicator of training and the only autoregulatory variable. We can't throw it away altogether. Some folks have suggested that soreness and damage have nothing to do with each other. That's just fucking straight bullshit. It's fucking bullshit, right? Like, so you do a set of 10, nothing gets sore. Is there a universe in which you are more damaged than you do with a set of 8 by 10 max eccentric overload? Are you fucking kidding me? Like, are you really willing to bet? Like, so for example, you did a couple sets of whatever, and you didn't get sore at all last week. No soreness, no DOMs at all. You were super honest. You did the whole palpation thing. You did the whole rating scale, 0 soreness. And then this week you did some shit, and it's like the kind of soreness that you can't like brush your teeth. Like, you can't flex your pec to brush your teeth. You got to drop the toothbrush. Are you willing to bet that there's a 50-50 chance that you're just as damaged both times? What the fuck are we talking about? Like, that kind of late onset muscle soreness results from immune infiltration into the muscles, which causes a shitload of secondary damage. It's been demonstrated a fucking ton. So, are there nuances in there? Like, if someone says I'm a 3 on soreness versus I'm a 2 from last week, is it necessarily more damage? Of course not. These are subjective scales, but it is a tool, and it is a very good tool. It's just not a perfect tool. Damage also correlates to performance, actually very well, right? So return to performance correlates to damage very well. So we put you on the isokinetic dynamometer, we get a max peak tension in your quadriceps or your knee extension, right? And then we do 8 by 12, some crazy shit to fuck you up. And then every day you come in and we measure peak tension. The damage, we also measure damage. So CK levels every day. When your CK levels roughly normalize is just about when you're going to have return normal force production. But those are also imperfect. There's not a perfect correlation there. Like, sometimes you're still a little bit damaged, but the neural effect has caught up and now you're stronger, right? Like, especially in early phase of training, they learn how to do the leg extension better. They can be stronger the next day. Fuck, you can get stronger in a familiarization session. You know what I mean? That's actually very well documented. It takes one session to make you stronger because you just know how to leg extend now versus not. So that's not a perfect indicator either, but mechanistically, nobody really debates that one. So what I would say is, how do you know if your muscles are damaged? I think there's probably 3 ways to do it. One, objective measurements of performance. So for example, if you come back in, you systemically feel fine, but you try to do pecs again and you're underperforming and you're like, fuck, your pecs are probably still damaged or potentially still damaged. If you have a lot of soreness in your pecs, they're potentially still damaged. And if you perceive a weakness in your pecs and kind of like, not soreness, but kind of, you guys know what I'm talking about, like a stickiness, like a frayingness to the muscle. Like, you're like, are your pecs healed? Like, they don't hurt, but they're like, I don't know, they feel kind of tight and kind of like, like you contract them and they're like, right? I think that sort of perception is also probably correlated to some extent to damage. Because what you can do, and I've done this before just for shits and giggles, I did it by accident once and then on purpose a couple times. You can do a really good workout that normally gets you sore, and then you take a lot of anti-inflammatories either before or right after the workout. You actually don't get DOMS most of the time. It's just DOMS just straight up never shows up. And I did this for my chest once. I never got this huge, like the full body pec DOMS, and you're like, oh my God, my whole pec's destroyed. You don't get that. but right here in the lines of the highest force where all the muscles converge, you have a, not pain, but a kind of a discomfort and a feeling that things are connected by strings. You guys know what I'm talking about? Like you get up out of a chair after squats and quads, you're like, dude, I swear to God, my knees could just pop off a fucking body at any point. Like it was that feeling for like 3 or 4 days, but that's direct damage, right? There's no immune system infiltration because the delayed onset, the NSAIDs just been like, fuck that, the immune system never showed up, right? So it's one of those things where if you combine all of those, you start to get a still imperfect but pretty good idea of how damaged you are, and then you make sure to dose appropriately so that you're, training at least as much as gets you to detect some damage, potentially more, and never training so much that you're super fucked up and you just show up to the gym again and you're like, let's fucking hit it, fella. What do you think?
No, I agree with that. I think that makes sense. And I just visualize Dr. Mike walking in with like fucking ibuprofen, just fucking going to town.
I eat it like candy. It's terrible because the Advil, they're sugar coated. They're delicious.
Are you serious?
You never had the sugar coated Advils?
Oh no. What do they sell?
You buy the Walmart ibuprofens, don't you?
Little gummy bears?
A gummy bear. Oh my God, how terrible that would be. You're like, kids just shit their kidneys right out because they ate like a whole jar of gummy bear ibuprofens. That would actually, you lead to total kidney failure right off.
Well, people would do that and they would still wouldn't take creatine because your kidneys. But
the creatine, the kidneys just don't get along. It's one of those things where it's like, you bring people in couples counseling and creatine's sitting there and the kidney shows up and they're like, I can't be here in the room with him. I can't do this. And there's this huge, come on, let's talk it out. Nope. Never again.
But no, I think they kind of conclude that. I mean, I agree with that. Basically, I wouldn't avoid muscle damage. It's going to be there when you progress volume. I too use soreness as a proxy for muscle damage, but I don't always think that when I think that's where we differ a little bit. I don't think that every time I'm sore that it's muscle damage. I just can't, when I'm very, very sore, that's exactly what I'm trying to figure out. That's what I've been trying to think about more often is what could also cause that feeling of soreness. Because, tension overload with nerves innervating the muscle fiber, been putting tension on that. Could the inflammatory response cause that as well? I'm not sure. I know damage for sure correlates with soreness, but it's...
but doesn't the inflammatory process do secondary damage? Doesn't it fuck shit up?
See, that's another question of mine as well. I know I have a little bit of information on that in my article, so that I've definitely seen that. But I'm not willing to bet that just your inflammatory system would just go ahead and damage muscle fibers on their own. Like, hey, let's just go damage these. I don't know if that makes any sense. What makes sense to me is once you damage something, the immune system and other metabolites go in to clean things up, the rough edges, and kind of lay down new material so it can do that. I kind of visualize, maybe talked about this with Steve before, but it's kind of like you fuck up your drywall a little bit in your room, you're fucking having a party, you fucking fuck up your drywall. Well, you kind of have to clean up the area and you kind of further damage the wall before you put down the drywall. And that's the way I kind of visualized it. So I don't know if that makes sense if you were just doing,
let's say, a lot of sense.
Go ahead, explain.
No, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, please go on.
Okay. Yeah. I don't know if that would make sense to me if you weren't doing a lot of eccentric contractions or if you weren't changing volume, how the inflammatory system would come in and just start to damage things. I'm not positive. I don't know.
Well, I don't think it usually does, which is why if you don't change things or if you don't increase volume, usually you can not cause a whole lot of damage and still cause a lot of tension, which I think there's a fine interplay there, which is why I'm not a big fan of programs that start with a lot of volumes. Like for every bullshit MRV argument I've ever had, I have the same like mirror reflection bullshit MED argument, which is where people say, well, you shouldn't train super hard because that's super crazy and you're going to die. And I say, yeah, well, when you start a program, average training is super hard. And they're like, no, you just start with average. I think some people are just very resistant to doing anything except for like 4x10. You're like, why don't we start with 2x10 and go to 6x10? They're like, no, you start with 4x10, you finish with 4x10. Like, well, okay. But like, something like the DAMA study shows is like, maybe you don't want to be super, because people say like, oh, I'm super sore. This is a talk I had with Jacob Skepis. I'm super sore at the beginning of the program. People say that's normal. Like, I don't think that should be normal.
Yeah.
I think you should ease in. What the fuck is the point of easing in?
That's exactly what I was thinking when I saw that study. He did a follow-up study. What if you started at what you would call an MEV and had less damage? And then you kind of built up to where they had it. I don't know, probably 3 sets of 10 for the study.
Yeah.
What if you built that up and had less damage along the way? would they have seen more results? That's a question I had for Felipe.
Sure. There's at least one study that shows that the results are roughly even, but you got to get the volumes right. And sometimes the introductory volumes are so low that it's not even MEV, and they're just pissing away 3 weeks, and the ramp up really only occurs in the third week or something. Mm-hmm. But I think if the theory, if the sort of hypothesis holds that damage is directly competitive with growth, I think the idea of putting people through 3 or 4 weeks initially of a crazy amount of damage just seems at least questionable. Maybe it's a good idea. Maybe there's some kind of interesting functional overreaching that occurs and ends up equating things. But I personally don't train people like that. When I used to be a personal trainer, I would start people with 1 or 2 sets and work mostly on technique, no loading. And even you guys have worked with beginners, the technique gets them sore. Like just a bodyweight squat gets them sore after a couple sets of 5. And then slowly add weight so that they never really have this like, oh my God, I'm super fucking sore. They start out with, I'm like, a little bit of a twinge, and then they keep going and add, and they never really get beyond a little bit of a twinge until, they decide they're going to deload. So the overreaching week before the deload gets them actually really sore. But it's funny, it's like most of my training, I get only a little bit sore, just a tiny bit, and sometimes not at all. But if I'm not at all sore, I'm almost always trying to increase either load or reps or volume the next time. Because if I can get away with not being at all sore, then I can probably do more volume and grow. And of course, it's not the only indicator, because performance is a really big one. But usually those two tend to align pretty well. I've never seen someone who get overlapping soreness for several weeks and not start to shit the bed in terms of performance, unless they're a raw beginner and it's all neuro gains. But, for advanced people, neuro gains don't mean hardly dick. You run through those in a couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. You know how to squat. You start high bar squatting again first time in 3 months. After 2 sessions, you're as good as you're ever going to be at high bar squatting. There's nothing.
It's actually a tangent question I had for you, Mike, on increasing volume over time. So based on any model, whether it's mine or yours, so I know you like novelty and changing exercises accordingly every so often. So let's say you have a certain amount of volume that's worked for you in your chest, let's say chest development. You're doing chest and tricep development. You're focusing on that for, let's say, an entire macro cycle. And you have a certain amount of volume you found, sets per week, let's say. You got really good results. You've seen the growth happen, and then you deload and you change the exercises up. So whatever amount of time it takes for you, you did a certain X amount of exercises. You didn't change those exercises. You increased the volume over time. Now you change the exercises. Now, would you keep the volume where it was for the new exercises? No?
Greatly reduce. Yeah. So like, if I'm going from 4 sets to 8 sets in a mesocycle, the next mesocycle, I might go 4 sets to 9 sets, same exercises. The next mesocycle, I might go 5 sets to 9 sets. The one after that, I might go 6 sets to 10 sets. And then I'm like cashed out. Then I switch exercises. When I switch exercises, I might go 2 sets to 5 sets, then 3 sets to 6 sets, then 4 sets to so on and so forth, right? So when you introduce a new exercise, you got to start take it easy, unless you get the Damas effect, where you just damage the shit out of yourself for no good goddamn reason. One of the ones that this is very easy to experience for most people is lunges. You guys ever reintroduce lunges? And you're like, 4x10, and then you just can't walk for a week and a half. Like, I literally, when I reintroduce lunges in my program every couple of months, I'll start with 1 set of lunges. I'll get a little bit sore. And then I'll do 2 sets. Then I'll get a little bit sore, and a 3 and 4. And then after a while, I'm doing 5 sets of lunges and only getting a little bit sore. Great progression, great results, no overdoing it. And it seems to make sense. There's also an injury concern there. It's been very well documented that the acute to chronic work to rest ratio, acute to chronic workload ratio, is like you're used to this amount of work chronically, and then you go like that blip, that little blip there is very likely to cause injury, right? Or is a causation mechanism for injury. It's basically unaccustomed workload. If you haven't done cable flies in a long time and you start with 6x10, 6 sets of them, you are essentially doing that. And then the next day you come in and do chest again, you might have received so much damage from this unaccustomed workload in parts of your connective tissue that you're not used to being damaged, that you may simply have an injury. Right? You may even have an injury during that, on the 6th set. Just that's it. So I think there's every reason to ease in when you change almost anything. I'll ease in when I change rep ranges. Like if you're not used to doing sets of 20 to 30, you don't just do 5 sets. You're, I'm used to 5 sets of 20 to 10 to 20. That's going to be a different stimulus. Metabolites, self-swelling, all that stuff. It affects you a little bit differently, and it can cause an extreme amount of muscle damage, extreme amount of soreness, and is really just not a good idea. Also, I think because the novelty effect has an effect, you can get more out of less when you start something new. The novelty effect is really just like being a beginner again to a certain extent. If you haven't done lunges in 8 months, it's not going to take 6 sets of lunges to get you more jacked. It might only take 1, just like if you ever started lunges for the first time in your life, it might take 1. Maybe because you're more well-trained, you've done it before, maybe it'll take 2 sets. So you start at 2. You don't have to start at 6.
No, totally. I want to ask your opinion on that because that's exactly what I do. So when I reintroduce exercises maybe I haven't done in like 6 months, I'll start very, very low. And like you said, I was like, fuck, like I was doing like 15 sets of triceps, and now it was like my first day. I haven't done these, and like close grip, my fucking triceps hurt. So I want to kind of bring that up because people will take your advice on the fucking progression sets, okay? That bullshit that you always talk about with the set increases or whatever.
Yeah.
And but they won't ever take into account the novelty exercises, and they go in like, oh, I was doing 10 sets before. Now I'm going to go to 12 sets, but I'm going to do bench instead of flies. And they're like, I can't do it.
Yeah. That's a real bad idea. One of the cool things about novelty is that because it's you sort of have to do less work at the beginning to get reaccustomed to the exercise, it's actually a great break for connective tissues. Because people are like, oh man, I'm so used to squats, I can do a ton of them without getting super fucked up. Like, okay, so you can do 10 sets of squats a week. That's 10 sets of damage to your joints a week. And nobody in the real world can say that shit doesn't add up. So at some point, if you go to leg presses and only 4 sets of leg presses a week, you're getting like pretty decent pumps and stuff. That's kind of a good thing. Like until you build up to 10 sets of leg press a week, you're actually getting like pretty decent gains from not so much joint work. And you might not be getting your best gains. You might get better gains doing 10 sets of squats than you were 4 sets of leg press. But because you don't want that excessive muscle damage, you don't want to pay the cost, it's kind of an auto brake mechanism, sort of an autoregulatory lower joint stress time. Some people rotate their exercises very infrequently or not at all because they're like, I'll just get worse at squatting if I stop squatting. But you got to stop squatting every now and again to give your joints a break. Otherwise, you're going to squat yourself into a fucking early grave. And if, a lot of, the best bodybuilders, maybe all of them will say like, yeah, like there's exercises that I won't do for a long time because they'll just beat you up and they're super effective, but you got to move away from every now and again. I think there's in some circles, especially maybe in like evidence-based natural bodybuilding, there's some circles of like variation is bad. I don't know where they come up with this, but like I'm just going to do the same movements for years or some shit. And it's like, there's upsides to that, but there's also downsides to that. So I think it's something that's, variation is beneficial, not just because it might reignite some muscle growth, not because it's just not boring anymore, but also because it might offer you the ability to train with slightly lower volumes for a while, even hitting the joints from a different angle. Because it's what causes long-term chronic injury? Repetitive high-volume stress in the same exact pattern. If you switch from leg presses to squats or vice versa, you get a change and a drop in volume at the same time for at least a short period. That can lead to a lot of healing and a lot of really like long-term progress. Does that make sense at all?
Totally. Yeah, totally.
Awesome. So amazing discussion between you both. And I just had one quick question for Alex in that Mike talked about how he autoregulates, and forgive me if I'm wrong, Mike, or correct me rather, based on kind of the perception of soreness, just fatigue within the muscle, kind of the fraying feeling, just kind of that perception, and then obviously performance. And I think, Alex, that wasn't how you autoregulate your own kind of volume in terms of like number of hard sets. Or is that also something that you use, or do you have a different kind of way of doing so? And actually, was that right, Mike?
It was, yeah. That's part of the way I autoregulate, in addition to performance and a few other metrics.
Yeah. So for autoregulation, I do use autoregulation, but I keep it very kind of like in the back of my mind. And I use the biggest proxy as performance dropping first, unless I'm super fucking sore to where, it's usually in the beginning of like a meso or something, to where just getting on like the leg curl machine, I can't even extend my leg. I'm like, okay, fuck this. But other than that, I use performance drops. So for example, like sets and RPEs. So if I'm using an example of like a leg press, and I undulate between like, let's say 8 reps on Monday and 10 reps leg curls on fucking Thursday. When I come back to that, if my same sets, my RPEs are super fucking high, much different from the past week, or I can't complete the same sets and reps for the RPE, then I'll auto-regulate that. So I keep in account the soreness I'm perceiving, but again, there's been times where I've been kind of sore and I've been able to almost get like PRs. So I use soreness, but I don't just use that. So me and Mike probably agree a little bit on that.
So just to confirm, is that a case of if performance is going down, then you reduce volume, or is that when you think about, or if you're recovered, you're increasing volume? Is that kind of the equation you're doing?
Yeah. And it's almost solely based on RPE or RIR. So yeah, so if I end up hitting like a bunch of RPE 9s out of nowhere, and the previous week it was the same load and the same sets, and I was getting like RPE 7s and 8s, I'm like, okay, next week I should be able to go up. And like for that day, for whatever reason, or those exercises or that specific exercise, I'm just like hitting the wall, or like my reps are now dropping for the same load. Then I will drop the load, or I'll drop the reps. Usually I just drop the reps. So if I got like 10 the last week, and then I got 10 the next week, and then this week for some reason I'm getting 8. I'm like hitting an RP 9. I'm like, okay, fuck it. I'm just going to like the rest of my sets, I'm going to do 8, 7, and 6 and just go to an RPE, whatever my RPE is for like 8, and my reps will drop. And that's usually on a day-to-day basis for whatever reason. And then the following week is usually better, and I can increase. So does that make sense at all? Like clear that up?
So I guess on a week-to-week basis, your sets are generally staying static. You're not manipulating that frequently.
No. Once I personally start a mesocycle, I start exactly how Mike explained, where I ease my way into it, because there's no point in getting that much damage and throwing myself under the bus. And it sets up the rest of the macro cycle very well. Now, after I get, let's say, for example, I might start at 2 sets and then go to 3 sets the following week. And then almost all my training is between 3 and 4 sets for months. And then at the end of, or whenever I think a deload should be coming up, I'll try and add in a couple more sets to functional overreach, which I think is great for a variety of reasons. I know we talked about that last time, but not only just to overreach, but just to see if I was being a pussy this whole time, and maybe I increased a couple sets, and then after that deload, I'm like, I'm not that fucking sore. This whole fucking time I could have done 4 and 5 sets, and then maybe I'll start the next mesocycle there. So usually I do auto-regulate just by reps and not necessarily sets. And that's just because, neurologic reasons, fatigue, stress, etc. For some reason, my body is just not allowing me to lift the same amount of load for the same RPE as last time. So I'm not going to hit failure to try and hit those reps, because that's a long-term gain.
Cool. Perfect. I don't know if, Mike, do you have any thoughts on that? Or
I think that's a fine way to do things. Yeah. I think I would be...
disagree. You have to disagree.
Well, here comes the disagreement. I think I personally am a bit more proactive on using sets and reps and weight to auto-regulate. And I use sets predominantly, in many cases, while letting RIR take care of the reps and the weight. So basically I modulate reps and weight to hit the RIRs I want in the weeks I want them. And then I use sets via proxies of, am I still performing on track? If yes, increase sets. If it's starting to look like performance is fading, keep sets stable. If performance declines, deload or take a light session or something like that and sort of recycle the process. So I don't do a whole lot of auto-regulation. I do auto-regulation with reps and weight, but that's just to hit RIRs that I want. But as far as am I getting enough volume and am I progressing in volume to some extent, if I'm able, that is something I address with work sets usually.
And my only other follow-up question would be for that, Mike, is there any kind of, there are obviously some muscle groups that are more easy to get sore versus other muscle groups just due to like the chest and how the muscle fibers are kind of displayed on the body. And it's just the eccentric damage is much easier on like the chest rather than say the back or something like that. And I don't know about you guys, but for me personally, at least something like calves, they very rarely, I think I could probably drive myself to a very high number of sets although probably see performance decreases. But there's some muscle groups, maybe some like the delts. Is there a way you find managing those muscle groups a little bit differently to say like the chest or the hamstrings, the quads?
Yeah, for sure. So some muscles just don't get very sore, and some muscles get sore, but they don't get DOMs. So like if I train delts really hard, they feel weak and super fucked up, but they never get DOMs. Side delts and rear delts. My front delts get DOMs like crazy. For those muscle groups, this is why soreness is not the only indicator. Performance is super golden. I train side and rear delts probably 3 or 4 times a week, so I'm very acutely aware of the performance metrics. And adding a set to that is another great thing about those kinds of muscles is that their systemic fatigue contribution is so small that adding a set's really not a big deal, and you can really just gauge local fatigue super easily based on performance. You get a great pump, you get nice and weak, you recover for 2 days from then. You do some more lateral raises and upright rows. Again, your pump's maybe not as great, so you do 1 or more extra sets. You get a great pump again. You get a little weak. You recover, you come back, and you keep repeating that. And at some point, you're doing kind of a lot of sets, and then for a whole week, you can't hit the numbers you usually hit. That means you've reached your maximum recovered volume by definition. And then you deload, and you maybe choose some new exercises and some new rep ranges, or not. You repeat the same, but sort of go back to a lower volume and start building back up again. Soreness never really enters the equation a ton, except for, to say that if I don't feel it at all, even a week after a workout, then I certainly do more work. And that's usually very well correlated with like pumps and stuff. Like if you get a nasty side delt pump, you're probably going to feel weaker after. I actually don't know if it's possible to get a really good pump and not feel weak for hours and days after. I don't think those two are separable, to be completely honest. Based on those, I don't really need this crazy top-end soreness because basically, for lack of a better term, performance hits first, right? Performance will decay first before you ever get DOMs. But for other muscle groups like pecs and stuff like that, performance and DOMs are really one and one. I find it's very rare that you can get lots of DOMs over and over, but still maintain a high level of performance. That almost never happens. Some muscles I'm not even willing to try it, like quads. I'm not squatting with sore quads because that's just how you get hurt. Like I'm not getting under 200 kilos of sore quads. I've done it before and I've gotten hurt. So fuck that shit.
Perfect. Cool. I don't know if we have time to cover kind of the second half of this, and we're almost kind of touching on it a little bit in terms of kind of metabolites and kind of that pump element and kind of how causative of hypertrophy is that? Because I believe, Alex, you kind of, in terms of like cell swelling, metabolites, you don't necessarily agree, or I don't know if Mike fully, if this is correct, thinking that Mike thinks that these are causative of hypertrophy. I'd love for you to maybe quickly describe your thoughts on this, because I know we're a bit short on time.
Alex, you want to start?
Sure. So unlike muscle damage, which we talked about extensively, I'm a little bit more curious about metabolites. I'm not willing to throw them out completely. I don't think we can do that. I think even anecdotally, we've had a lot of anecdotal evidence suggesting that they do something and they're warranted in your training for adaptations. I just want to discuss this really cool study that I drew out for my master's degree and I didn't have time to do or the funding, but luckily enough, I think Jorn was a part of this study, but it was like a recent study of this year, 2019, where they actually did an occlusion study. So they did occlusion training, but they occluded the limb and had no training, so there was no tension. And then they did the other group where, so that was one group, the second group occluded the same pressure and then they added tension. So basically what they did was they induced metabolites in both groups. And again, the one that they induced metabolites with no tension, they saw absolutely no increase in muscle protein synthesis. Now that doesn't mean that they don't count and I'm going to rule it out, but there's some cool evidence like that. It kind of makes me like, I don't know. I don't think they're causative perhaps on their own, but maybe with during a session or with tension, they may further increase NPS or something like that. So I'm not sure. I'm really not sure about it right now.
It's a good study. So another interesting study that was recently done was they introduced lactic acid directly into laboratory animals and caused growth, which was pretty sweet. So I think the concentrations might be very different. So there's a difference between how much lactic acid you can accumulate in the periphery and the blood vessels and nerves and stuff, and how much pain that causes, versus how much lactic acid actually gets generated inside a cell when it's busy contracting, which might be like an order of magnitude difference, like 10 times inside the cell. If you had that much outside of the cell, the pain would be fucking unbearable. You would just get into actually, you'd probably you'd almost certainly get into systemic acidosis and potentially die.
Is that a human study?
Say what?
Is that a human study, or is that like
animal study? Animal study. That would be a sick human study. We're going to inject lactic acid into your fucking muscle. Like, fuck, this hurts. Like, shut up. Do these curls.
Well, I don't know if it would be like a petri dish, like in vitro or.
Sure. Yeah, I don't remember the exact details of it, but okay. And then there's another study that actually linked lactic acid biochemically to muscle growth pathways. So that's kind of interesting. What I'm thinking is so the following. When I've read quite a bit on how tension causes growth, and there's mechanoreceptors in the muscle, but first of all, they don't really know exactly what the transduction pathway is between mechanodetection and growth initiation. There's a lot of steps there, so I have no idea about. But some of the steps look like phosphatidic acid might be involved, or calcium might be involved. And then those are technically metabolites, right? They're intracellular compounds. So when people say that, growth is caused by tension may cause the release of metabolites inside the muscle, which cause muscle growth to be signaled, right? So tension itself signaling growth, maybe. There would have to be a demonstrated mechanism for that. And another question is how much metabolite actually leaks out from one cell, leaks into another, and causes growth in that cell. And the answer is probably much less than you see intracellularly. So, for example, calcium has been hypothesized as a growth mechanism because when you have your motor units firing as much as they can, the amount of calcium that floods the muscle is hugely different than if they're firing not nearly as hard as they can. It's those crazy concentrations that we see close to failure. Remember, if tension really caused hypertrophy just by itself, you would think that one repetition and then rest for a long time, and then one repetition and rest for a long time, and one repetition rest for a long time in the heavy range, say 80%, that would cause robust muscle growth. It's just as good as any other training method. As you do 10 repetitions total, rest in 2 minutes between them. That's a set of 10, right? That should grow as much as a set of 10, but all the research we have, and it's not very good, but all the research we have so far says you probably grow a lot more muscle if you do all the reps back and back and back to back to back, which is another way of saying that the amount of tension transduction is probably the same, signaling should be the same, but the amount of intracellular phosphatidic acid, calcium, and a couple of other metabolites is radically different. As the amount of calcium you get inside a cell when it goes 10 to failure is fucking massive when it just does one rep, and then you relax and the calcium gets reabsorbed in the SR, and then relax, and so on and so forth, may never reach those levels. And it might be that, inundation with calcium and perhaps some other metabolites that really causes hypertrophy. Maybe, right? So once you sort of have that understanding, you think, okay, but the next question is, really what we're asking with metabolite training is, do the metabolites leave their cell and go to other adjacent cells to signal that hypertrophy? And the answer is it might not leave in high enough concentrations to do a fucking thing. So it might all be intracellular anyway. So the only way to do that is tension anyway, right? And that may very well be the case. So when people say, it's metabolites versus tension, and it's really just tension, there might be another way of saying intracellular metabolites. Which do high reps address that? Yeah, sure, but about as well as low reps do. And so I'm very curious of metabolites, very open question. Just one thing I want to leave off on is I don't really understand the fascination some folks seem to have with finding the cause of hypertrophy, because in almost every other system, hypertrophy related, we have multiple causes. For example, pop quiz. What causes muscle growth from a nutritional and pharmacological perspective? Is it leucine? Is it whole amino acid fractions? Is it insulin? Or is it testosterone? Or is it myostatin reduction? What a fucking idiotic question. It's all those fucking things, man. It's a multifactorial process. Like if you draw out a graph, its input, hypertrophy is in the middle. There's those like from textbooks, the arrows that all that stuff points in. And so there's people out there hypothesizing it's just like the fucking muscle growth. And on the training side, it's just tension. It's tension. That's it. Tension. Like you couldn't surmise that there could be 3 or 4 or 5, and some of them we don't even know, and maybe one little tiny arrow for damage, or maybe not, right? Or a U-shaped curve for damage, who the fuck knows, right? But like people are just like, no, it's got to be tension. It can't be metabolites. And then that fucking lactic acid study comes out, and they're just like, nah, shit, fuck, that sucks, right? So why are we looking for just one? We just need to be open-minded and see where the research goes. And so far, there's been no real convincing case that metabolites cause muscle growth. But there's some really interesting stuff where you're like, oh, we can't rule it out. And then self-swelling, there's multiple studies that show self-swelling directly causes hypertrophy. It's not even up for debate. Is it relevant in human training? Is the muscle pump enough self-swelling to cause hypertrophy? Is it some kind of hypertrophy that's more transient and it goes back down and back up? Oh, we don't know. But people that say, look, the pump has nothing to do with hypertrophy, yeah, but it's just make-believe. They're just making that up. Like, it's all about tension. Like, is it really though? Is that why every bodybuilder on the planet swears by the pump? Maybe they're just stupid and maybe they're wrong. Maybe, and I'm honestly saying that, I'm not being sarcastic, but maybe it's worth listening to. And potentially there's multiple mechanisms for hypertrophy, just like there are in the nutraceutical realm.
Very cool. I really enjoyed that. And I think that helps everyone to think about these things a little bit more. And I guess inherently we always like there to be one answer, like a black and white, it's this or it's this, because that makes life easier in many ways. But I think trying to do that in this case may be making things harder, or at least less effective potentially.
Do you guys remember the song Black or White by Michael Jackson?
I don't.
Alex, how old are you?
Very young, dude.
Apparently.
Very young. 26.
Do you know who Michael Jackson is?
He was a white fellow, right?
You're not wrong. Show me on the doll where he touched you. We can make millions. But on a serious note, it was a shitty joke that was never took off. Black or White was going to be Michael Jackson reference. Macaulay Culkin was in the music video. Alex, do you know who Macaulay Culkin is?
Yes.
Thank God. No, don't laugh. You don't know the Black and White video. I don't even know if you're a real American. Steve, you're more American than Alex here is, because he doesn't know the Black and White video. Do you know Thriller?
Yeah, I know Thriller.
Okay. Billie Jean?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, you don't know MRV, so I don't even know what you know.
I don't give a fuck about MRV.
We're gonna run a political campaign against each other where, like, I'm just gonna be like on a freeway and there's gonna be a road sign that says fuck MRV. I'm just gonna be like, God damn it, I'm gonna take ads out on you and be like, do you really want a presidential candidate that'll just have you train with the same amount of volume for a whole mesocycle? I don't think so. Vote no on proposal Alex vote.
Yeah, and then I'll get all the Trump supporters, I guess. It's the same game.
Make America do volume again. I don't know. Steve, what's British politics like? Is it Boris something or other?
Boris Johnson, yeah, mad hair. He's our Trump equivalent at the moment.
Sweet.
He's not much
better. You
better.
guys are having a lot of fun.
I could be the president, he'd be like increasing prison sentences every week by sets and shit like that.
That's a good idea. Auto-regulated prisons. I like it. Maybe we can run on the same platform.
I did want to see if there was anything like practical recommendations in terms of metabolite work, pump work within there. And I think there are, if people know at least Mike's work well enough. And I think the same can be said for your work, Alex, is that we're still kind of, we're not ruling it out, but it's not something that we're putting at the forefront of a training program. It's more something that is used more sparingly, and less of a focus is put there, but we're still tying it in because there's good rationale behind that. And it's certainly not a bad idea.
Getting stronger for reps over time should be your number one goal. If that's happening, then that's great. If you're never getting pumps, so you're never feeling a burn in the target muscle, especially with sets higher than 10 reps, you should probably be figuring that out. Either your technique sucks, you should be doing more, or your nutrition sucks. You know, like if you're on low carbs all the time and you're losing weight, you never get any pumps. And coincidentally, you don't grow. Maybe not coincidentally.
They should make like an intra/pre-workout that's called Metabolites.
Just drink lactic acid. Awful.
Yeah, exactly.
Lemon juice. Pour lemon juice on your muscles.
Guys, I want to say a massive thank you again for you both coming on. Again, really productive discussion. I think we brought out some really interesting ideas and concepts, and I'm really intrigued by just the ever-evolving field in this area. And I think we're getting closer to the truth, which is what this is all about. So again, thank you both, and we'll catch everyone soon.
Peace. Thank you so much.